So these fishing stocks, how do those work? Are they more or less localized so that fishing in one area or overfishing in one area doesn't affect other areas too much? Or does influencing one area, or does overfishing one area affect the rest of the ocean? Do these stocks kind of move around too much, or how does that work? And then also, I assume you talked about reporting, so I assume you need licenses or some sort of oversight in order to get permission to go to these. So just, yeah, could you explain just how that part of
Yeah.
the fishing works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there are different types of stocks that behave in widely different ways. So let's look, for example, at tuna stocks. So tuna, everybody eats tuna. It's a very high value commercial species. There are different types of tuna, some of which are higher value than others. But you know, generally it's a very important commercial stock. So tuna is what we call a highly migratory species. So if you look at the swimming patterns, the sort of migration patterns of tuna, you will see that they move at high speed through very, very long distances. And they obviously cross the boundaries of many countries, and they also cross the high seas where individual states cannot sort of extend their sovereignty. So highly migratory species like tuna are very difficult to regulate, because even if one country decides to regulate tuna in a highly sustainable way, they on their own would probably not be able to have an impact on the way in which tuna is managed, you know, in a particular region. The reason for that is because the highly migratory stock crosses, like I said, crosses many boundaries. And so in order to sustainably manage this type of stock, you need international approaches. Basically, you need states to come together and decide together how they are going to manage the stock. They will regulate their respective fishing fleets, and their fishing fleets will then pursue the tuna, they will capture it, and they will basically apportion those captures between them. So essentially, this makes the management of these species very, very difficult. In the past few decades, there have been a number of international organizations. They are called regional fisheries management organizations, and they manage different tuna stocks and also other stocks that are also highly migratory, or sometimes they're not highly migratory, but they are also transnational in the sense that they cross boundaries from state to state, or they live partially in the high seas. And usually on an annual or biannual basis, the representatives of these states will get together and they will adopt measures for the conservation and management of these species, or maybe not adopt conservation measures, but decide what kind of allowable catch they can capture that particular year and how that catch is going to be distributed between them. So the problem with this is that, well, I mean, there are a number of different problems. First of all, you have countries and industries that have invested a lot of money in the capture of these stocks, and they obviously want to catch as much as they can, to earn, you know, as much as they can, because fish for them is a product, basically. On the other hand, you have conservationist interests. They are interested in preserving these species. The majority of them look at the preservation, the conservation of these stocks from a sustainability perspective, but there are different values in this. There are also groups that are interested in the capture of fish maybe from an animal rights perspective, or, you know, from a cruelty perspective. There are certain practices that are particularly destructive and cruel. I'm thinking, for example, about shark fishing, shark finning, which is the removal of the fins. Sharks are also highly migratory, and so certain types of vessel that capture maybe tuna, but normally other species like swordfish, that are also highly migratory, they also capture shark. And some of those vessels also engage in shark finning. The sustainability concerns here get sort of coupled with other concerns involving cruelty of handling these animals and so on. Then also there is complexity in terms of the scientific knowledge that we need to manage these species. Some of them are better known than others. And also very important, the data that the fishing vessels are collecting so that sound management measures can be adopted. Some of the data that is collected is insufficient, some of it is not good, some of them sometimes can even be misleading. Sometimes the reasons for the lack of data or the bad data are unintentional, and sometimes they might perhaps be intentional. We don't always know. And sometimes the lack of data is the result of poor management, that just the decisions to collect data are not made. Sometimes the data is very difficult to collect as well. So there's all sorts of difficulties that converge to make the management of these species quite challenging, basically. Yeah, and on top of all that, there are like lots of different states that have to reach agreement on, basically important decisions like how much fish we're going to catch, how much impact are we going to have on the species that maybe we're not interested in, but that swim together with this fish, and how we are going to distribute it amongst us. There's always tensions around this. So, there are also development considerations. There are states that are growing and their development is improving, is increasing, and they want to invest in their fishing industries. And they exist in tension with the more older traditional fishing countries that tend to be wealthier and tend to be part of the Western developed world. So yes, as you can see, it's a very complex area, and there are lots of different priorities and interests that often are in opposition and tension, and that also creates a very interesting environments for researchers like myself. You can never get bored.
Yeah, I assume a lot of fishermen who do this as their lifestyle are concerned about the sustainability of their fish stock, of course, because they don't just want to get as much as they can out of it. They want it to be there for years if that's going to be their career. Yeah, I know you study a lot of the illegal fishing practices, and the numbers I looked at said like 1 in 5 fish that are sold are illegally caught, at least, or some illegal practice in that chain somehow, which is that's astonishing. Actually, that's a big number. Could you explain the different parts of that? Obviously, not all of that is shark finning. It's just So I guess what's illegal even about fishing? Is it the location, the type of fish, too much fish? Like what makes it illegal, I guess?
Okay, so what makes it illegal? You know what? That's a big question. But let me just try to explain how the law operates at different levels, and then we can maybe pay a little bit more attention about what exactly makes the act of fishing illegal. Well, the first thing I need to say is that when I have told you earlier about the value of IUU fishing between 10 and 23.5 billion with a B, the value of this is not just illegal fishing, it's also unreported and unregulated. So unreported and unregulated fishing aren't always legal. So these figures involve, yes, a lot of those fishing activities are definitely going to be illegal in the sense that they breach an applicable law. But some of them are not necessarily illegal. For example, there may be legal loops that enable a particular fishing activities or fishing activities in one particular area to take place without reporting anything. That's not illegal because it's permitted by the law, but it doesn't produce any data, and therefore it could be considered unreported fishing. Okay, so these definitions are very problematic. So depending on which perspective you use to look at them, they can generate a type of data or another. But let's just think of IUU fishing as something that it may or may not be illegal, but it's always kind of undesirable because it's either hidden or it makes management and regulation more difficult because we don't know what's going on. And, these are finite, they're renewable resources, but they're finite. So, we need a lot of information to manage them well. Okay, so that to one side. Your question was what makes fishing illegal? Okay, so fishing is regulated by states, by governments. It's regulated by states whether the fishing takes place near the coast or far, whether it's in the waters of that particular state or in international waters or in the waters of a foreign state. There's always going to be a state that manages or is responsible for regulating that fishing activity in one way or another. Within 200 nautical miles of the baseline of a coastal state, normally the coastal state will have a regulatory authority over the stocks that occur there. Now the regulation in that area of the sea is quite complex, but it's very important to understand, I suppose, two very basic general principles. That's one of them is the competence of the coastal state to govern the stocks that occur in that region, so within 200 nautical miles of its coastline. And then beyond that point, the coastal state doesn't regulate the fish stocks there anymore. What happens is that the vessels that operate there, they all have a flag, in the sense that they are all registered to a particular state that we call a flag state. And so it will be the flag state that governs the activities of those fishing vessels in the high seas, in international waters, basically. Now, those states will pass laws and regulations to govern those activities, and they will do that in different ways. You know, some states have different types of law, some states regulate better than others, some states have the means to control the activities of the fishing vessels, and some states do not. So it will vary very, very widely depending on which state you look at. But the thing to remember is that wherever the fishing vessel is, there's always going to be a state who is entitled and indeed has the responsibility to regulate, to govern those activities. Obviously, the closer the fishing activities to the coast, the easier they are to regulate and control, and the more coastal states are interested in regulating those activities. Activities that are taking place in the high seas are much more difficult to control, and they happen far from home. Their impacts maybe are not felt as keenly, and so they maybe states, you know, the flag states are far away from these fishing vessels and their impacts, and maybe, you know, there's not so much of a priority to sort of govern the activities and impacts of these vessels.